As we covered last time, men will find the most gruesome ways to kill each other in war. And World War I was truly one of the worst times for creative ways to kill. So last time we covered chlorine gas and its development and use, but we also saw the downfalls of utilizing that specific gas. In today's episode, I would like to cover phosgene, which is the gas that Germany followed up chlorine with. Hi nerds, I'm not Gabby B, and let's jump into it. So, first of all, what exactly is phosgene? Phosgene, or carbonyl dichloride, is a toxic liquid or gas that damages skin, eyes, nose, throat, and lungs. It is a chlorinated chemical compound, and it is either odorless or it smells like freshly mowed hay, which, as you can imagine, makes it very hard to detect. And this is unlike chlorine gas, which we discussed previously, because that is just very apparent that you've been gassed. Phosgene was discovered in 1812 by John Davy, who was a Cornish chemist. And you can actually find his research on this online for free. It's called On a Gaseous Compound of Carbonic Oxide and Chlorine. And it tells of him producing phosgene gas by actually exposing carbon monoxide and chlorine to sunlight. It was then named phosgene, which is from the Greek word meaning to give birth and light, so from two Greek words. The name referenced the necessity of sunlight in order to actually complete this reaction. The funny thing about his research, though, that at least I thought it was funny, is he wrote about the smell of the phosgene and about the fact that it produces large amounts of tears, which is really brave. Like, scientists in the 1800s literally were like, okay, I just created a mystery gas, so let me just inhale it real quick. Love that for them. Like, he could have died, but he didn't, so that's the good news. But anyway, phosgene itself is an important industrial chemical. Even today, it is an important chemical intermediate in the production of polymers, agricultural chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and dyes. So basically, it's very important in just a lot of manufacturing. In the lab, however, phosgene isn't used very much anymore in chemical synthesis, and this is due to safety concerns. So they've actually just found safer alternatives to using phosgene, which is fair. But those safety concerns that scientists were worried about is exactly what made it a good weapon of war. So, according to science.org, 12 million metric tons of phosgene are produced annually to synthesize polyurethanes and polycarbonates. This number is also estimated to rise to 18.6 million metric tons per year until 2030. Also, since phosgene is so toxic, only few facilities can actually manufacture it, and if they produce over a certain amount, they actually have to be registered with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, or OPCW. Today, phosgene is produced through the chemical reaction of basically carbon monoxide plus the chloride, and then you'll have like a catalyst, which then produces phosgene. And usually the catalyst used is activated carbon or something along those lines. So, interestingly enough, the mechanism of phosgene formation is still debated, but most scientists can agree that the reaction is initiated by the activation of the chlorine to chlorine bond. So the activated carbon catalyst acts to lower the activation energy of the reaction. Activation energy is essentially the amount of energy needed for the chemical reaction to occur. So the science.org descriptions of the possible reactions is really in depth because it was from an article that was talking about a new way to actually create phosgene gas. But I don't want to lose anyone here. So, brief summary of both of these is basically the first one, the chlorine binds to the surface of the carbon, and then the chlorine atom reacts with the carbon monoxide gas and it forms an acyl chloride entity that then reacts with the surface bound chlorine to form phosgene. So, an acyl is basically a functional group in organic chemistry or chemistry in general. An acyl is a functional group where a carbon atom is double bonded to an oxygen atom. So an acyl chloride would be that functional group plus a chlorine. I hope you're following. So I'll try to put some stuff up for you guys to visualize what I'm saying. So now this is the mechanism proposed by one group of scientists. The other mechanism utilizes an Ely-Rideal mechanism, which is basically a reaction pathway in which a gas reactant and an adsorbed species on a solid surface interact to form a product. But the important part of both possible mechanisms is things get to the point where the acyl chloride reacts with chloride and form phosgene. And a lot of this information comes from an article on science.org that basically tells of a new way to make phosgene, as I said before. So it's still a work in progress. So everyone caught up? Cool. let's carry on. So, the probable first use of phosgene in warfare was again pioneered by the man who starred front and center in my last video, Fritz Haber. Also, I say probable because one source said it was France, and then all the others were like it was definitely Germany. But while I was researching this, what I found, and then I also had like Stekui helping me out, we both found like every single source was like Germany did, Germany did, Germany did, and we're like okay, and then they'll be like, well, the Allies made it their primary chemical weapon, but that would just be one sentence. Like apparently it was all Germany, even though they themselves say the Allies did it too. Very fun stuff. But anyway, after having success with showing German high command that gas warfare could be effective, Haber decided to move on to a gas that was similar but different. So, as we said above, phosgene is odorless and colorless, which makes it harder to detect. In fact, for it to be detectable, it had to have a zero point 0.4 parts per million concentration, which is way higher than the concentration that was needed for it to be deadly. And remember how the first use of chlorine gas was at the Battle of Ypres in April of 1915? Well, by December of 1915, the Germans had moved on to phosgene gas, with the first use of phosgene against British troops on December 19th, 1915. And once again, it happened close to Ypres, this time north of Ypres, where the 49th Division was positioned. So this attack was revealed by a German prisoner early on, and in response, an artillery barrage was ordered on the German trenches, but there was a shortage of artillery shells, so they were not able to disrupt that planned gas attack, even though they knew it was coming. Note, I got the information for this attack from the Western Front Association.com, so really good resource there. But basically, at 5 a.m. on December 19th, the 49th observed a parachute flare along with red rockets rising up shortly after at 5:15 a.m. So these were then followed shortly afterward by a hissing noise and an unusual smell. Around the same time as all of this commotion was going down, they started to hear small arms fire from the German trenches right before the gas was discharged. And they were able to hear this because from where the 49th Division was positioned, no man's land was only about 20 yards in certain places. But right after this discharge of gas, 20 raiding parties were sent in to observe what happened with the gas, by the Germans, and to also take prisoners of war. So out of these, only 2 patrols actually made it to the British line due to heavy British fire, but the released gas formed like a white cloud that was about 50 feet high, and it lasted for about half an hour before it was dispersed by the wind. The gas attack was deployed at a 3-mile range along like the front lines, but it moved for about 10 miles after it was blown away. So it was a lot of phosgene. Now, during this attack, unlike the chlorine gas attacks at Ypres, British troops did have gas helmets. And yes, not masks, helmets. And I'll put a picture of that up here. However, these were fitted for chlorine and not phosgene, so, they were not fully prepared for like a brand new gas to be used. The newspapers on January 1st published the following about the attack. Quote, whilst the list of casualties to the local territorials as a result of a German gas attack on December 19th is serious, we are asked to deny a rumor that many men are dead. End quote. So one of the battalions that was affected the most was the 1/4 Coily Battalion, and their war diary for that day contains the following quote. And this is going to be a long one. So 4:50 a.m., a hissing noise like a fast-running motor car was heard in the German lines. Very shortly after, the presence of cylinder gas said to be phosgene was detected in the air. Warning was given to put on anti-gas helmets, and rapid fire opened on the enemy's parapet with rifles and machine guns. A message saying SOS gas was sent to the artillery, who immediately opened fire. No infantry attack was made by the Germans, but later a German patrol numbering about 10 was seen advancing towards our trenches. Rifle fire was opened on them and they dispersed, only one man being seen to regain the German trenches. End quote. So the war diary also records that in this battalion, 1 officer and 23 others died of gas poisoning, with 6 others killed in action. And in the following days, 14 men from the 1/4 Coily Battalion would then succumb to their wounds. And these are just the numbers I was able to find for one battalion, not even for all of the battalions that were involved. Now, while the attack was not as deadly as prior chlorine attacks due to soldiers being slightly more prepared, that doesn't mean it wasn't as bad. See, the thing about phosgene is that it was more effective and deadly than chlorine. but it could take up to 48 hours for symptoms of poisoning to appear. And due to the colorless, odorless nature, soldiers wouldn't be able to easily tell if they were accidentally exposed for 48 hours. So, according to the US Army website on phosgene, the initial exposure to phosgene leads to mild irritation of the nose, throat, and respiratory tract, as listed above. But hours after being exposed to high concentrations, the air sacs in the lungs fill with fluid and lead to chest tightness, coughing, and shortness of breath. Frothy secretions at the mouth and dramatic drops in blood pressure and dry land drowning in the lungs may also follow. In addition, phosgene exposure could lead to chronic bronchitis, asthma, and emphysema. So, to address dry drowning in this case, it's essentially when fluid in the blood moves into the lungs, leading to pulmonary edema and then death. Phosgene also reacts with proteins in the alveoli of the lungs, aka the parts of the lung that allow for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the blood. So, like, very important. And so, this disrupts this process, which can lead to suffocation. All in all, just a terrible time. So basically, it's highly effective, highly deadly, and phosgene, as well as a related agent, diphosgene, were actually responsible for roughly 85% of the 91,000 gas deaths in World War I. Which, guys, I'm not a historian, but I thought that number would honestly be higher. Like, I'm glad it's not, but I really thought it would be higher. And according to one of my sources, though, the Germans actually utilized a mix of chlorine gas and phosgene from April to August of 1916. Just, to make it extra deadly. Because they never stopped to ask themselves the age old question of just because we can, does it mean we should? But the Germans were not the only ones utilizing phosgene. In fact, it became the Allies' weapon of choice and they ended up ramping up production. So in the US, Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, they worked to produce phosgene gas by passing carbon monoxide and chlorine through a carbon catalyzer at high temperatures to generate the gas. They then would liquefy the gas in order to fill shells and shipping containers. This meant that during production, the entire area had to stay well below the gas's boiling point, and at many times, the rooms that the gas was worked on were kept at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So the plant would fill shells and shipping containers, and they would send these to Allied troops in iron drums that could hold about 1,700 pounds. Edgewood Arsenal didn't only produce phosgene, though. There were 3 plants that produced chlorine, mustard gas, and phosgene. These plants were built in 1917 to 1918, and by the end of the war in 1918, Edgewood Arsenal had produced more than 935 tons of phosgene. So this plant also produced like mixtures of gases, because you know how I said earlier Germany was mixing gases together? So did the Allies, from what I could see, with the total US toxic chemical agent production in World War I being about 2,500 tons. So eventually, gas shells became the primary mode of gas delivery, and although Germany had pioneered the employment of gas shells in the winter of 1914 to 1915, the French proved more innovative in fuse design. So by using only a small bursting charge to open their phosgene shells, the French increased both the payload of the shells and the concentration of gas on target. So both sides exploited the advantages of artillery. They had better accuracy, flexibility, and less dependency on weather than, gas warfare. So, gunners ultimately delivered some 85% of the toxic gases during the First World War and caused about 85% of the gas casualties. Gas shells grew from a negligible proportion of artillery ammunition in 1915 to about 50% of the German, 35% of the French, 25% of the British, and 20% of the American ammunition expenditure by the armistice. Had the war continued into 1919, all the belligerents planned to employ even more chemical shells. But yeah, World War I participants really utilized phosgene and they actually came up with really creative ways to deploy this gas, as well as mustard gas, which mustard gas was starkly different. This gas was very similar to chlorine gas, but mustard gas is actually a misnomer. So the thing is, a lot of the research on the effects of all of these gases weren't done until after World War I. They were just lobbing this shit back and forth at each other with no idea how it would affect them. The literal definition of shoot first and ask questions later. And then because the different countries just ended up making gas cocktails, it made studying the effects of these individual gases so much more difficult. Like they had a hard time trying to study exactly what effects were due to what gas. However, since the harm caused by phosgene gas is really similar to that of chlorine gas, they were able to just use whatever they treated chlorine with to treat phosgene. So at the very least, there was that. But yeah, guys, that's really all I have for you today on phosgene. I really do wonder what the people doing this to other humans felt. Like, you'd have to be far removed from any compassion to make a call like that, or desperate enough to see that there was no other choice. I don't know. In the last episode, a lot of you talked about knowing people who were directly affected by chlorine gas, and the stories were really sad and dark. But guys, I'll leave you here. Thank you all for listening. Next episode will be on mustard gas, and then we can probably go into other like technologies. You guys let me know. I'm having fun researching all of this, learning about it. It's interesting. But yeah, thank you all. Bye nerds.